Opportunities in the Marketplace by Victor Yup and Doris Monk. Chapter 5. Isaac. It's all small stuff. Genesis chapter 26 verses 12 to 33. Snoopy, Charlie Brown's dog, was having one of those lazy, carefree days, doing nothing as he plopped his stomach on the floor in his kennel and then walked around aimlessly and restlessly, sighing in his thoughts. I'm growing old, and I've never done anything. I've never chased a rabbit. I've never barked at a burglar. Cats scare me to death. I hate retrieving ducks. All I ever do is sleep. After pondering his options, Snoopy went back to sleep, this time with his head contentedly rested on a rock, his back on the floor, facing the blue sky, admitting to himself, well, I guess each of us has his own special calling. Unlike Abraham, Isaac lived an easy life and had it made. He was a boring guy who lived a ho-hum life and made no ripples in life. Unlike his father and his son, he did not loom large in the Bible. He was more like a small print footnote stuck between two important dissertation and larger-than-life characters. His father, Abraham, was the father of many nations, Genesis 17:4, and Jacob, his son, was the father of the nation Israel, Genesis 35:10-11. Unlike Abraham and Jacob, who traveled abroad, Isaac lived a sheltered life and had never left home. His parents even ordered a bride for him, Genesis 24:3, but after the death of both parents, he had a rude awakening. Curiously, he imitated his parents' tag-team lie disastrously and gambled with Rebekah's life when he told the Philistines that she was his sister. Genesis 26:1-11. God did not let Isaac down, even though he let him fail. Isaac later made up for his past inexperience, mistakes, and immaturity. Slowly, he stepped out of his father's shadow, experienced God for himself, and got along impressively with his neighbors. How should we respond to people who intimidate us? To whom should we turn when we are alone and afraid? Why is it more blessed to turn the other cheek than to fight tooth and nail when our enemies offend us? First, shut up and pull out like a gentleman. Genesis 26 verses 12-23. Isaac planted crops in that land and the same year reaped 100-fold because the Lord blessed him. The man became rich and his wealth continued to grow until he became very wealthy. He had so many flocks and herds and servants that the Philistines envied him. So all the wells that his father's servants had dug in the time of his father Abraham, the Philistines stopped up, filling them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Move away from us. You have become too powerful for us." So Isaac moved away from there and encamped in the valley of Gerar and settled there. Isaac reopened the wells that had been dug in the time of his father Abraham, which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham died, and he gave them the same names his father had given them. Isaac's servants dug in the valley and discovered a well of fresh water there. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen and said, "The water is ours." So he named the well Esek, because they disputed with him. Then they dug another well, but they quarreled over that one also. So he named it Sitnah. He moved on from there and dug another well, and no one quarreled over there. He named it Rehoboth, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." From there he went up to Beersheba. What is a gentleman? Here are my favorite quotes. A gentleman is a person who is clean inside and outside, who neither looks up to the rich nor down on the poor. A gentleman is a person who can lose without squeezing squealing and who can win without bragging. A gentleman is a person who is considerate to women, children, and old people, who is too brave to lie, too generous to cheat, and too sensible to loaf. A gentleman is a person who takes his share of the world's goods and let other people take theirs. A gentleman is one who puts more into the world than he takes out. George Bernard Shaw. A gentleman is one who is too brave to lie, too generous to cheat, and who takes his share of the world and lets other people have theirs. Paul G. Hoffman. The final test of a gentleman is his respect for those who can be of no possible service to him. William Lyon Phelps. A gentleman is, rather, than does. Isaac was a gentleman. His actions were never out of character or out of range with the person he was. He did not get mad, turn bad, or get even when he was pushed to the edge by the bad guys outnumbering him. Isaac, at first glance, was a coward, a victim, and a loser, but his silence must be examined in the context of the danger he faced. He was a foreigner. His wells were plugged up by the Philistines, and he was invited to leave by none other than Abimelech, the Philistines' ruler. Genesis 26:15. Not only had Isaac suffered hostility shown by the Philistines, who stopped up the wells that his father Abraham had dug up. Also, his relocation to the valley of Gerar was met twice with resistance from the herdsmen of Gerar, who seized the wells and water that his servants had discovered. Genesis 26:20 and 21. The third time, however, was a charm for the nomadic Isaac, who later discovered water in abundance. Genesis 26:23. Isaac appeared powerless, but he was not spineless, toothless, or brainless. He ran out of water, but he did not run out of options. He would rather move willingly than be removed forcefully. Nobody laid a finger on him, his family, herdsmen, flocks, or possessions. Abimelech was impolite. The Philistines were jealous, the first occurrence of the Hebrew word envy in the Bible, Genesis 26:14, but no fist was thrown, no fight had ensued, and no party was hurt. Feelings, sensibilities, and relations were hurt, and that was all. Isaac was wronged and hindered, but he wasn't wounded or harmed. There was always another well, another spring, another discovery elsewhere. So he moved to the outskirts, to the valley, to the frontier. He was not at the point of starvation. He had just reaped 100-fold harvest, Genesis 26:12. It was more important to be blessed by the Lord, of which Isaac was. The references to God's clear, unmistakable blessing on Isaac, Genesis 26:12-13, in a sense were more striking than God's blessing on Abraham. Abraham was wealthy, Genesis 24:35, but Isaac was very wealthy, Genesis 26:13. Robert Elliott said these classic words: "To avoid stress, rule number 1 is, don't sweat the small stuff. Rule number 2 is, it's all small stuff." In the words of the Chinese, as long as the Green Mountain remains, why fear there is no wood to burn? When it is not a matter of life and death, sticks and stones, the last resort or the last straw, investing time, money, and energy to change people's minds, opinions, and feelings is costly, draining, and unrewarding. The only command Isaac had received from the Lord so far was to stay in the land, Genesis 26:2-3, and although he left Gerar, he did not go down to Egypt, which the Lord had forbidden. God promised the land to Abraham and Isaac, but he did not stipulate for Isaac to claim the city of Gerar, its waters or wells, where he was harassed. More importantly, Isaac was an adventurer by nature, Genesis 26:23. Even if Abimelech, the Philistines, or the herdsmen of Gerar did not drive him away, plugged hubby's wells, or did anything funny, foolish, or fanatical, he still would have left, which he did even after digging another well and finding uncontested water at Rehoboth. Genesis 26:22-23. In this tit-for-tat, an eye for an eye, and dog-eat-dog world and society, Isaac was peerless as a gentleman. He left without a fuss, last words, or a tinge of regret. He was one of a kind and had a different philosophy altogether. The world did not need another jerk, another showdown, and another casualty. Instead of thinking the well-followed Chinese tradition of "you get me the first day of the month and I'll get you on the 15th," think, "if I don't work in the East, then I'll work in the West." Second, step up and press on as an heir. Genesis 26, verses 24-25. That night the Lord appeared to him and said, "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and will increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. There he pitched his tent, and there his servants dug a well. Several years ago, Time magazine, for a change, put a Christian figure on a new face on its cover, Franklin Graham. Franklin is the son of the world's most famous preacher, Billy Graham, whose radio broadcast was carried by 660 stations. Growing up, the younger Graham was often embarrassed and bothered by his father's well-wishers, who often said, "Dear little William, Frank, we heard that your daddy has new help for preaching God's truth, so grow up fast." Franklin had his turn at rebellion when he was young. Neighbors called the local sheriff one instance when they saw the younger Graham chopping down a neighbor's tree with 720 rounds of machine gun fire. Smoking was also a hard habit to break. To make him quit smoking, his mother attempted to sicken him of smoking by forcing him to smoke a whole pack of cigarettes. He finished all of them, vomited 5 or 6 times, but refused to give in. While he was sent to a Christian boarding school, he taunted the local police to high-speed car chases and cultivated a fascination for firearms. The younger Graham eventually accepted the Lord at age 22, but it took him another 22 years to emerge in his own right and on his own terms to succeed his father, Billy Graham, at the helm of his father's ministry, after garnering respect for starting a new breakthrough ministry, Samaritan's Purse. Franklin Graham reflected on his turnaround and transformation and said, "People might say, 'Come on, you've got it made. Your father is Billy Graham. You have a perfect position before God.' His reply, however, was, 'No, I don't. No one can choose God for you. You must choose.'" Isaac's knowledge and experience of God were initially second-hand, family-owned, post-dated, and by default. God blessed him only after his father's death, Genesis 25:11. His father was a typical immigrant who made his mark and fortune in the new land, but unfortunately Isaac was a passive second-generation recipient who was just going along for the ride. However, Isaac resolutely kept moving until he found God, which he did at Beersheba, the same spot where God was known to have appeared to Hagar, Genesis 21:14. Now he had a direct, personal, and real relationship with God. The first time God appeared, he said to Isaac, "I will be with you," Genesis 26:3, but this time God said to him, "I am with you," Genesis 26:24. As it has often been said, God has no grandchildren. God now confirmed his relationship with Isaac using the present tense, just like his father, Genesis 12:7, 8, 13, 18, Isaac built an altar and called on the name of the Lord, Genesis 26:25. His faith was no longer a symbolic act, a traditional ritual, or a family practice. Hebrews 11:9-10 tells us that Isaac stood tall as an heir of the same promise Abraham inherited. By faith, He made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Isaac's name was mentioned in the same breath with Abraham by his grandson Joseph, Genesis 48:15-16 and 50 verse 24, and was given the same honor by God himself, Exodus 3:6, 16, 4 verse 5, 6:3 and 8, 33 verse 1, and Leviticus 26:42 in the Torah, and Jesus in the New Testament, Matthew 22:32 and Luke 13:28. God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and not just Abraham and Jacob. Isaac also made a name for himself planting crops, something his father Abraham never did. Abraham loved the mountains, Genesis 12:8, the oaks, Genesis 18:1, and trees, Genesis 23:7. But Isaac made his life in the valley. Yet Isaac's biggest achievement was not carving a name for himself as a maverick, but inheriting and embracing God as his own, as an heir should. He was a giant the day he stepped out of his father's shadow, stepped into his own shoes, and stepped up to the promise. Third, speak up and patch up to be a peacemaker. Genesis 26 verses 26-33. Meanwhile, Abimelech had come to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, his personal advisor, and Phicol, the commander of his forces. Isaac asked them, "Why have you come to me, since you are hostile to me and sent me away?" They answered, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you, so we said, 'There ought to be a sworn agreement between us and you. Let us make a treaty with you, that you will do us no harm, just as we did not molest you, but always treated you well and sent you away in peace. And now you are blessed by the Lord.' Isaac then made a feast for them, and they ate and drank. Early the next morning, the men swore an oath to each other. Then Isaac sent them on their way, and they left him in peace. That day, Isaac's servants came and told him about the well they had dug. They said, 'We have found water.' He called it Sheba, and to this day the name of the town has been Beersheba. In the Academy Award-winning movie Braveheart, one of the most significant developments in the training of Scotsman William Wallace, the fighter and warrior who initiated Scotland's drive to independence, was the advice given to him by his father when he was grooming the young boy for adulthood. Young Wallace had wanted to join his father and brother to fight against the English, but his father objected and prevented his youngest son from joining them. The young Wallace objected. "I can fight," but his father restrained him, saying what turned out to be his last words to his son, I know you can fight, but it's our wits that make us men." Later, when his uncle Argyle came to take the revenge-minded orphan Wallace with him, he caught William looking at his sword, handed the sword to him, and took it back as he tapped William's head and said, "First, learn to use this. Then I'll teach you to use this." Years later, when an adult William Wallace returned home, the first person who picked a fight with him was his old childhood friend, the big, burly, brutish Hamish, a fierce fighter who later became Wallace's loyal sidekick. Hamish tried crushing him by throwing a huge rock at Wallace, who had promised not to move as he teased Hamish. "I was wondering if you could do that when it matters, as it matters in battle. Could you crush a man with that throw?" The furious Hamish shouted, "I could crush you like a worm," and proceeded to throw the rock at Wallace, but he missed. William then hit Hamish in the forehead with a tiny stone he had picked from the ground. Hamish, who had crumbled to the ground, admitted defeat and said, "Aye, welcome home. Aye, you busted my head." Wallace turned and said to his friend, "Well, you should have moved." Isaac was a gentleman, not a guerrilla, an heir, not a brat, a child of God, and not his grandchild. More triumphantly, he was a peacemaker, not just a peacemaker, a peace-loving man, a good neighbor, and an honorable ally. When Abimelech came with his personal advisor and the commander of his forces to make a treaty with Isaac, Genesis 26:26-27, Isaac bravely questioned Abimelech's strange visit, his latest motive, and past treatment. Isaac was not easily deceived, intimidated, or persuaded. He heard their side of the story, listened to the solution they offered, and used his head as well as his heart to settle their cold war, their mutual suspicion, their past and potential conflicts. Isaac spoke up to end the conflict, to secure peace, and to move on. Isaac, contrary to belief, was not the type to gloss over a problem. He was not a weak man who would not speak up or stand up to bullies. When the occasion arose, he brought up Abimelech's past hostility to him and asked him why the ruler hated him so and had sent him away. Genesis 26:27. Isaac unequivocally chose the word hate, verse 27 in Hebrew, or hostile in NIV. When the air was cleared, they made peace. Making allies with the locals was not a bad thing. Abraham did it. Genesis 14:13. In the end, Abimelech, with all the hurled threats and verbal abuses, had not harmed Isaac in the least bit. Genesis 26:29. To practice kindness to strangers, Isaac even invited them to a feast instead of sending them away empty after they had made peace. Isaac was the first peacemaker in the Bible. He was the first one to be credited with living in peace with his neighbors. Genesis 26:29 and 31. God's blessings followed Isaac the peacemaker. Conclusion. Life is too short to keep enemies and records. Are you at peace with God, with yourself, and with others? Are you living in peace with your spouse, 1 Corinthians 7:15, with the church family, 1 Thessalonians 5:13, and with all men, Hebrews 12:14? Inherited faith need not to be musty faith. As an heir of God, have you claimed God for yourself? Have you confessed God in your heart? Do you count on Him in all things you do, for all things you have, through all things you face? People will grow old, but faith must be young. Do you seek and follow God's promise, His path and path for your life? Bible study questions. Background. Isaac had a personal experience with God before chapter 26. 1. What kind of blessing did Isaac receive from God? Verses 12 to 13. 2. What consequences did Isaac's wealth bring? Verses 14 to 17. First, verse 14. Second, verse 15. Third, verse 16. And fourth, verse 17. 3. Isaac's servant dug 3 wells. What did he name them? What do they mean? Verses 18 to 22. 4. What action did Isaac take when others quarreled against him? What was his attitude? Why? Verses 18 to 23. Note verse 22. 5. What teaching and guidance did the Lord have on this matter? Verses 23 to 25. 6. How did Isaac respond to God? Verse 25. 7. Who visited Isaac? What did they see? What was the purpose? Verses 26 to 29. First, who came to visit? Second, what did they see? Third, what was their purpose? 8. How did Isaac treat these people? Verses 31 to 32. Personal application. 1. Have you experienced God's blessing in the workplace? How have you worked at it? 2. Have you felt and experienced the pressure of bullying and competition from others in the workplace? How did you face it? 3. Meditate on where God has given you wide space. Do you have a prosperous place in your life? Name a well that God has given you. 4. How do you build an altar and call on God? How has He helped you? 5. How has this lesson helped you as a disciple of Christ to understand your role, identity, participation, influence, and relationship with others in the marketplace? Group sharing. 1. Share what kind of competition have you encountered in the workplace. Were you aggressive or passive? 2. Is competition with others acceptable as Christians? What is acceptable? What is not? Give an example. Are there any gray areas? 3. Share how God has helped you in your work difficulties or personnel disputes. 4. Share how we can build an altar, call on the name of the Lord in the workplace. Give an example. 5. How should we treat those who quarrel with us? Do we prepare a feast for them and make a peace covenant with each other? Is it feasible in real life? What similar actions can we take?